put a Floyd Rose nut on here, but we haven't got a shelf and we haven't got anywhere to put screws. And you can see there's a big gap under there where the screws should be. And you need screws, because otherwise this happens. The existing shelf looks about the right height, or within a reasonable height for the action. So we're cutting a bit of wood to add to make the new shelf. And that's some hardwood. It's a little bit like maple. I'm not quite sure what it is, a bit too red for that. I'm making the base very flat on a file. So we've got a couple of good edges there. We don't care about the other edges yet. Yeah, there's the parent wood that it came from. Now I'm putting an angle on the front to match the front face of the locking nut. And just filing down the ends of it to size. Most of it's going to go away, as you can see. Only a very small part of that's going to remain, but it's filling up that gap there. And it's going to sit there. So we're gluing straight on top of the headstock overlay. I've sanded it with this bit of sandpaper on the end of a stick that I use for small things occasionally. Those truss rod cover screws are obviously going to disappear, and we're going to use this here, which is strong, slow setting, and maybe can allow a little bit of creep if things move around. And before I glued it on, I wet it to raise the fibres, and then I filed those off, so I had a slightly porous surface for the epoxy to key into. So we've got far too much epoxy here, which will eventually squeeze out and wipe off, but yeah, bit of a mess. And the other reason I'm using epoxy is that I don't have to clamp it, but I'll still get a strong joint. And we're joining quite disparate surfaces. There it is after it's cured. That's a Holley carburettor adapter plate I found on the side of the road. It's designed to stuff 4 barrels into a 2-barrel manifold, which seems utterly pointless to me, but there you go. But I thought that'll make a good router platform. So that's what it should have on one side. Anyway, we've cut the middle out and screwed it onto my neck clamp, or my neck base. The piece of wood at the back is a stop to prevent the router going back too far, and now we're going to start routing down that piece of wood. So after the first pass, this is, just check on progress. We've still got a long way to go, but we've got a flat surface there appearing, and we're not quite at depth. Now, I should say I'm routing from right to left to make sure there's no blowout into the work. And we're nearly there, except at this point it's become apparent that the routing platform's not parallel to the neck. It's about 1/3 of a millimetre high on the end of one side. So I'm adding a couple of pieces of paper there to shim the platform up on one side. And now it is level. And we're very, very close to the end. We've only got 1/5 of a millimetre to go down, which is, 2 thicknesses of newsprint. So I used those 2 thicknesses of newsprint to set the depth stop. And now the last pass, and we're there. We've got a flat level surface that'll accept a locking nut. And you can see not much of the original wood's left behind, but it's just the right amount and just the right place. And hopefully the silhouette against the sky can show you how flat it is, but no, it didn't really focus. And there it is in sunlight. And the truss rod's still accessible. Right, so now we've got to mount it. We've got to tie it down somehow. There were I had a few abortive attempts that I won't show here, but I came to the conclusion I'd have to plunge route it with a 4mm cutter. So I made a lot of practice attempts here, and it's complicated by the fact that the holes in the nut are not parallel to the centre line of the nut. So to match the nut, the holes look completely off. So I was kind of, I wasn't sure what to do there for a bit. Right, so the holes are going through the neck like that, but I'm actually tipping them very slightly. I'm going to exaggerate. This is exaggerated for purpose of illustration, but I am going to make those holes ever so slightly angled that way to try and pull the nut back in towards the corner of the shelf. So there's my bits that I'll use for these holes. That's my 4mm cutter, which can plunge. And that's an 8mm cutter, which cannot plunge because the bit doesn't cut in the middle. So I'm setting that up with a spacer there and a fence behind the router. That's some template I used to route a control cavity at some point that I'm just using to hold the router there. Then I've got those pieces of wood setting end stops for where the holes will be plunged. And we're just about ready to go. So I've just made a very, very slight plunge into the surface to check that those holes are where the nut is. I've gone a bit further here. That was supposed to go all the way, but it didn't. So it was a bit of a cock-up. But we're getting there. Now, I compared it against another nut. This nut's got different flaws, but it has got the holes in the right places. I wasn't sure whether to make holes that match my nut specifically or make holes that would accept any locking nut. In the end, I ovaled one of my holes very slightly so that it would accept either of those nuts. Maybe I should have just made it accept the one that I wanted. Anyway, so we're through now. Holes are in the right place, thank goodness. You can see the slightly oval hole on the left. And when it punches out the other side, it is very clean. That's the little bit that fell out. So there we are, just an overview, all clamped up. In the cradle with a bit of, oh yeah, here we go, another view of the exit holes. It's a very clean way to make a hole. And there is the nut bolted on to the neck for the first time. But we're not quite done yet. We have to recess those screws very slightly. I'm not going to recess those screws nearly as much as Floyd Rose's usually are because I'm trying to keep as much wood in the neck as possible. So the neck's back in the cradle and we're going to use that 8mm cutter just to plunge very slightly into the surface, just like that. And there they are. So that's all the routing done. And there is the nut mounted. And you can see, yeah, I've only just taken enough to get those screws flat. And yeah, the screws are proud, but my thumb doesn't go there, so it's fine. I didn't want to take away any more wood than I had to. Those 4mm holes are enough. I didn't need another 8mm hole halfway into the neck. And yeah, you still access the truss rod, so that's pretty good.